Recently, I had the pleasure of being interviewed by Jay Taylor, and I thought you might like to hear that show.
Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Lew Rockwell. Most of you know Lew. Certainly most of you who listen to this show would be familiar with Lew Rockwell, but for the benefit of those who may not be familiar with him, he is a proponent of the Austrian School of Economics. He is chairman of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. He is the author of a book titled The Left, the Right, and the State. That was published in 2008. More recently, he's written another book called Against the State. Like my friend Jeff Deist, who is also now with the Mises Institute, Lew also served Ron Paul as his congressional chief of staff. That was back in 1978 through 1982. Mr. Rockwell is closely associated with his teacher and colleague in the past, Murray Rothbard, until Murray Rothbard's death in 1995. Lew is also the publisher of the political weblog LewRockwell.com. I would really urge you to go there. There's an abundance of refreshingly libertarian thought that I think has the potential to actually restore sanity into people's lives again. So anyone who listens to this show on a regular basis can understand why I'm really pleased to have Lew back with me again today. Thanks for joining me, Lew.
Jay, great to be with you.
Always good to talk to you. We don't do it often enough, for sure, and I must confess that I don't partake of a lot of the material that you have at LewRockwell.com as frequently as I should either. But it's all a matter of time, isn't it? And finding a time and allocating time. It's a tough chore, especially these days with so much information coming at you from so many sources. Even if you try to stay into a free market libertarian perspective, there's a lot coming at you as well, which I guess is one of the bright spots in our future, potentially at least, if we have a lot of information along lines that wasn't available to people in the past. At least now we have the internet and provides some contrarian thought, right?
No, it's true, and thank goodness, because as Tom Woods always points out in the tradition of Rothbard, when it comes to any significant issue, there is no difference. Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, they're all the same. If there's a war to be started, if there's a candidate to be defeated, there's absolutely no dissent. They're all exactly on the, have to hate Russia, go to war against Russia, whatever, or go to war against Iraq, go to war against Iran. I hope not, but that's certainly a lot of them would like to do it. There is no difference. So how wonderful that we do have, as you say, all these sites on the internet giving us a different point of view so that people can make up their own minds and not just be brainwashed by the mainstream media. In the old days, it used to be just the three channels.
Right.
Now there are many more, but they all sing from the same ugly songbook.
It seems to be the case, doesn't it? And, somebody said if everybody's thinking alike, no one is thinking. And it seems to be that is a lot of what's going on. I know the work of Bernays. You may be familiar
Sure.
with Edward Bernays and his work, and it's something I want to address on this show sometime in the near future, because I think it's so important. How is it that we have all become sort of thinking along the same lines? So, I mean, it's very easy to know what is politically correct and what views you're supposed to take with regard to any issue. It's just like we're all just being programmed like monkeys to think alike, and just to, without any thought, just to obey the state. And it is a frightening prospect, I think. So, somewhat refreshing then in many ways, although with some trepidation. I've been very intrigued by Donald Trump and what he's doing, because it does seem as though there is an undertow of discontent in the country about the status quo, about the things you were just mentioning, endless wars. And clearly, if people don't understand why, they do understand that their standard of living has been in decline, especially most of the middle class, except for the upper 1% or 1/10 of 1%, perhaps even now. I was talking to a friend of mine, a banker in New York City, and he's talking about the 1%. I said, Jay, probably you're talking about the 1/10 of 1% that are really skimming everything off the top, because at least in the New York City area, you can have a pretty good living standard, a pretty good salary that would go far, probably down in Auburn, Alabama, where you are there. But New York City, people aren't doing all that well if they're making $100,000 or $200,000 even. So, in any event, I'd like to talk to you, Lou, about, or have you talk to us, I should say, about Donald Trump. Now, really quite a phenomenon, I'd say, wouldn't you? I mean, really out of nowhere, it seems.
Well, tremendous, and of course, a tremendous personality, successful businessman, very successful businessman. He's no libertarian, that's for sure.
Yeah.
On the other hand, as Rothbard used to point out, about the only hope in a system like ours of reaching over the heads of the elite directly to the people is by the kind of guy that is sometimes called a demagogue, somebody who's got the rhetorical power, the personality, and you would hope the right ideas to be able to communicate, because otherwise everything's shut off by the media, by academia, by big business, by big government, of course, primarily. All these forces working together to, as you mentioned, Edward Bernays, his phrase, engineering consent. So they all are wanting to get our consent to what they're doing, and it's always an important thing to keep in mind that they actually need our consent. They worry about our consent
Mm-hmm.
because they are a small group relative as compared to the rest of the population, even though there's a vast number of people on the government payroll, but they still are a minority, those who are net tax eaters, as John C. Calhoun would have put it, and net tax payers, the rest of us. So that is as Mises pointed out, that is the class struggle in society. It's not Marx's class struggle of the producers versus the proletariat and so forth. It's actually those ripping us off through the state and those who are being ripped off. So if anybody can appeal to the ripped off, it's something quite wonderful. And I don't, I have like I guess everybody, my very serious doubts about Trump.
Yeah.
About all I will say about him, I think he's besides, of course, being such an extraordinary figure, it's a big bonus with Trump that all the right people hate him. So when Grover Cleveland was nominated for president, and the guy giving the nominating speech was sort of a boring speech, and it wasn't until the seconding speech that the convention went wild, and he ended up by talking about. He said all the things we love Cleveland for: his iron will, his sense of justice, and so forth. But he said we love him most for the enemies he has made. So, I mean, that's right. I mean, so if somebody has all the right enemies, that's something. Also, my guess is that Hillary Clinton will be 100% evil. Donald Trump might not be 100% evil. So I don't say much more about him for that, except that he has brought up the unbelievable evil of cultural Marxism, political correctness, for discussion. They all agree, of course, on this stuff. The entire elite and all their followers. So the rightness or the wrongness of cultural Marxism, it was just imposed on us. It was never discussed, never questioned. So he helped do that, and he also helped bring up the whole question of immigration. There's been a deliberate federal policy to demographically change the country without any discussion. There was, in fact, if you said boo about this, you were Hitler. So it's good that this can be discussed. So what will Trump actually do? Will he be any good? Will he actually turn out to be better than Hillary? I have my hopes. I, of course, would never vote for anybody, let alone give them a donation. But in Rothbard's phrase, I'm rooting for him, just like I rooted for Pat Buchanan, who was a similar figure, or some others. But I must say I wouldn't put a lot of faith in him. As you point out, anybody who runs for office, there's something. With Ron Paul, I would say, is the sole exception I've ever known. He doesn't actually want power over others. So it's what St. Augustine referred to as the libido dominandi, the desire to dominate, and of course it comes with the will to dominate, want to run other people's lives. Most of us have enough of a job running our own lives, being concerned with our own families, our own community. We're not actually interested in running the next town or the next country. But there are people, of course, who live for that, who also enjoy killing. I mean, the people who rise high in the state tend to be people who like sending out kids to kill and be killed, and they get a charge out of that. You don't want people like that in charge of you. So we just have to see what happens. But I must say this is the most fun election I can remember since Barry Goldwater. And Trump is being attacked much more than poor Barry was.
Well, I think, they'll probably have already tried to make Trump look like he would, they give the same image, the mushroom cloud that they did with Barry Goldwater, make him
Exactly right.
the dangerous guy, when in fact, as you said, we know 100% what we're getting with Hillary. We know what she's going to be about. We know what the establishment's about. It's about endless wars. It's about more socialism. It's about ripping people off, penalizing those that produce, and giving to the bankers and others who skim off the top, who don't really produce anything, but just basically line their pockets with new money creation out of thin air and redistribution of wealth. It is a horrible story. It's if only the American people could understand what's going on. But do you think anyone, very, very few people, what percentage of the population has any understanding that creating money out of nothing is a redistribution process from, and not only that, but it isn't even going to the poor people, the people in the middle class. It's going to the rich. So while Bernie Sanders talks about, taxing the rich or whatever, the policy of redistribution goes on to the people at the top through the money creation, right?
Well, people, I think this can be explained to people. In my experience, and I know this is in your experience too, people can learn about this. It clicks with them, even though they start out not knowing much economics. And that's deliberate, by the way, because if you know some economics, it helps you see exactly what the government is doing. But I think more and more people are feeling ripped off. They are being ripped off. The standard of living is declining. The power elite is getting richer and richer and richer at the expense of the rest of us through the state. And it's a very nasty system. And I think people are waking up, and it's the job of people like us, Jay, to try to tell them about what the real issues are and what economics has to tell us, what real history has to tell us. The right sort of political philosophy has to be obviously put in simple terms. But I think, there's just a huge amount of upset, of really roiling upset among the American people that scares the pants off the establishment. They worry about this. This is one of the reasons they hate Trump so much. Also, they hate Trump because, and of course, we're only talking on the margin, he seems less of a warmonger than Hillary. So he said, which of course is considered an unbelievable outrage. He said, I can deal with Putin. What? Wait a minute. You mean you don't want to nuke him and kill everybody in Russia because they're just like the Soviet Union? By the way, the Soviet Union was never much of a threat to us either because they were such an economic basket case. That was pretty much all a con game too. But Putin, as compared to Hillary or Bush or Obama, is a much more peaceful guy. I mean, he's actually not as much of a warmonger. It doesn't mean one can endorse him, but or anybody else in public office. But the idea that we should have a nuclear war with Russia and maybe end life on Earth over some some ridiculous issue like Crimea.
It's absurd.
It just is straight. Well, it's more than absurd. I mean, it's actually insane.
Yeah, I mean, and here we go with the troops, the NATO troops stationed around Russia right now. We don't allow the Chinese to patrol their own sea lanes. And yet the Chinese don't have their warships in the Gulf of Mexico or off our coast somewhere. The Russians are not here either, and yet somehow they are the biggest menace that we have. Somehow, I mean, that's the way it's presented to us, and I guess it's what Eisenhower warned us about: the military-industrial complex. Who's in control of this? I know Jeff Deist once. I was talking to him about this, and he said, Jay, each of these big bureaucracies in the government are, mammoth entities that are really out of control. Each of them. And so who's really running the show here? Is anyone running the show, or is it just a growing level of chaos around, in the system? Or is there someone who could actually guide this ship?
Well, first of all, of course, they're running us is the problem. It's true there are these gigantic national security bureaucracies and other bureaucracies. I would say more important, you have the outside power elite. You have the George Soroses of the world, the Charles Kochs, the multi-billionaires who use the government to enrich themselves and achieve their invariably very left-wing social goals ever since John D. Rockefeller, and maybe long before that, if one were to look back into history, the oligarchs tend to be social leftists. Ralph Raico argues this is because they want to get the intellectuals on their side because otherwise they would be subject to attack for being wealthy. And this is a way to protect themselves from the state. So I think Garrett Garrett had some other reasons. It was a way to separate themselves from the middle class, from the bourgeoisie who tended to be socially conservative. So for this reason, they became socially leftist and collected the wackiest kind of modern art, and as Nelson Rockefeller did, and so forth.
Right. So you can see someone like a George Soros who's insanely wealthy and not draw any criticism from the left, essentially, because he espouses all these liberal, not liberal in the traditional sense of the word, but totalitarian, really, and redistribution or Marxist, leftist, communist sort of philosophies, right?
Well, we can see the power of Soros. There was a great article on Zero Hedge the other day about you've had this unbelievable leaking of internal documents of the Open Society Foundation, or Soros' foundation, and some of his other groups about what he's doing. And Zero Hedge pointed out there's been no attention paid to this in the mainstream media.
None.
Zippo. So this guy is very, very powerful. Hillary's got a number of these people around her who are her funders and her controllers. So who's actually controlling things? Well, it's not just Soros can't push a button and bring about something because, of course, of these gigantic bureaucracies. But if you are encouraging the state to expand, if you're encouraging the state to gain more power and do more horrible things, and you're enriching yourself in the process, that is a far easier job than trying to get the state to restrain itself. So I think really it's a combination of the state, of all the various bureaucracies, and of these outside figures. One thing we always have to remember about the state, as evil as it, unbelievably evil as it is, I would say it's mankind's greatest enemy on earth. Nevertheless, it tends to be a stupid institution. So the ideas and the sort of intellectual guidance comes from outside. It comes from academics and other intellectuals, but it's put into effect by the Soroses, the Rockefellers, all these sorts of people.
Well, these are people that have tremendous amounts of money. And again, I think it was Lord Rothschild that said some time ago that if you allow me to control the money system or the printing presses, I do not need a standing army. So what he meant by that, I think, is that he could buy people off. So you have the Clinton Foundation, for example, that is tied in so strongly with these leftist, with leftist ideas, and they pose as capitalist, as real free market. I mean, you know, people think of them as capitalists and good people, but it seems to me, though, it's all about buying people off in a sense, isn't it? What about the Federal Reserve economists? They all think alike. They're all basically Keynesians, so for the most part. They can't see any different way. They could never envision Ludwig von Mises or any of the Austrian school thinkers, could they?
No, and it's Larry Parks did a study once showing that almost every, except Joseph Salerno here at the Mises Institute, almost every single monetary economist in the country is on the payroll of the Fed. And this, of course, is not exactly shocking. This is the way these criminal organizations work. So either they're getting invitations to very super-duper conferences, or they're getting fellowships, or they're getting to do studies, or they're brought in for a time at themselves at the Fed. They're all on the payroll. So yes, they all sing the Fed song. And it's exactly the same in the so-called national security area. Everybody, all the intellectuals are on the government payroll or on the payroll of the big companies, the big military contractors, the merchants of death, as they used to be called in an earlier era, who are the promoters and strategists of war and help the government decide who they're going to murder next. It's a complex situation, but it's power and money that drive everything. And also, I think I would argue evil. I mean, I think these people are evil. They're not just mistaken. There are a lot of mistaken people. These people at the top are uniformly evil.
You know, I mean, I've known a lot of younger people who are trying to make their way in life, and one particular young fella at the church that I attend, he was in history. That's his history is his field, the one he loves. And yet I could see in my discussions with him how difficult it was for him to pursue history from a completely objective point of view. He had to write and think and say things that would satisfy his professors if he was going to get the grant that he needed to continue on. So isn't this the way they? This is the way they do it. If you're a young person, you have a family, you need to feed the family. How do you go about? How do you make your way? Well, you have to just sort of step in line with your superiors, right? That's the way they control you.
Well, it's very tough. I'll remember when Tom Woods, who was summa cum laude all the way through school. He had his bachelor's in history from Harvard and his MPhil and his PhD from Columbia, all under top teachers, early publications, wonderful teacher, wonderful writer. He couldn't get one interview. Not only couldn't he be hired as an historian, he couldn't get one interview. Nobody was interested in talking to him because he was a libertarian. And history is, if anything, even worse than economics in that way. So yes, to be a historian who is going to explore the actual who did what to whom and why, those questions, of course, are all forbidden. You have to teach especially the official story of all the U.S. wars, if we're thinking our own country. You're not allowed to ever question the glory and the wonderfulness of every single murder the U.S. has committed. How many millions of people has it killed in its long career of war? I'd love to know an accurate figure. A gigantic number.
Yes, and we still watch movies of the evil Hitler and all of that, and yet we don't pay too much attention. I mean, how many Americans really understand that George Soros was involved in the overthrow of the Ukraine government that was elected by the people, and that it was a conspiracy on the part of George Soros's people. I think there was also a Zero Hedge article recently that pretty well documented that. Daniel McAdams, who's been on this show frequently, has talked about the connections between Victoria Nuland and George Soros and his various NGOs. So people don't really understand this because, as you say, they're not allowed to. I mean, they're allowed to, but they're not told in the mainstream media. So thank God for the work that you do at the Mises Institute and people like you. But with a few minutes we have left here yet, I'd just like to refocus a little bit on Donald Trump. As you mentioned, he's a businessman. Is that a positive, do you think, for the presidency?
To my knowledge, and I'm glad to be proven wrong, there's never been a dictator businessman. So that says something. Doesn't mean there couldn't be a first, of course. And in fact, really all American presidents have been dictators since Franklin Roosevelt, Lincoln, and Woodrow Wilson before that during their wars. So I think it's good. I think it's good not to be part of the gang. Maybe you'd have some new approaches. It's one of the things that scares the whole regime about him, that he's unpredictable. And of course, I think that's a good thing. Because if he's unpredictable, maybe he'll actually do something good, as shocking as that might be. I'm trying to think, when was the last time a president did anything any good? Well, I guess we could say when Nixon legalized gold ownership.
I guess that was actually under Jerry Ford a little bit before that. But then Nixon, I think, in my view, is one of the worst presidents we've ever had.
Yes, horrible.
He opened the money spigots for the kind of indebtedness and runaway inflation and redistribution of wealth that's occurred when, in 1971, he removed gold from the international monetary system. But it's hard to figure any president of late that's done good. But if you look at, with respect to Trump and his desire to deal with Putin, I mean, you could sort of see his business cap going on there. Oh, yeah, I'd like to open some hotels in Russia. And okay, well, maybe you can, maybe there's something we need in the United States, Vladimir, that you can provide for us. Well, let's see if maybe we can work together here on this thing. And that's sort of kind of what I thought. At the same time, he seems to be such a raving lunatic at times. So Donald Trump, it seems to me, could really, as a businessman, might think like a businessman instead of a dictator, as you suggest, and could do some really good things possibly. But again, I am concerned about his temperament and his use of language. Sometimes it seems to be a little bit erratic. And what are your thoughts on that, Lew?
Well, I kind of like his use of language I know that he's called a lunatic, but if we think, what is being presidential supposed to be? Well, it's supposed to be cold and ordering the deaths of millions without any emotion. I mean, that's the way you're supposed to be. Well, is that supposed to be is that a superior a superior thing. Scott Adams, the guy who does the Dilbert cartoons and has an interesting blog, he argues that Trump is one of the great persuaders he's ever seen, and that everything he does is calculated. And I think, and of course, he's always been seen to be an off-the-cuff kind of a guy. On the other hand, you can't build a skyscraper like that. So you have to, every detail is important. Every item has to be planned. So I don't know that this is, who knows what the actual situation is, but Adams argues that what seems to be mistakes on Trump's parts are really aspects of a brilliant persuader as a great salesman and negotiator. So is that correct? I don't know.
Well, it could be, and it certainly would seem to be sort of a breath of fresh air in honesty. When he speaks out, it's off the cuff, it's not planned, so it's not contrived the way politicians, of course, run their lives in a contrived manner, all calculating to make sure they increase their power. So, well, yeah, what I was thinking a moment ago with regard to this book I read on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, just reading through that book, you get the sense of the discontent in Germany during the 1930s as a result, of course, of World War I, the reparations that were imposed on the German people. We know the story, how the German economy was run into the ground. And to a certain extent, Lew, it seems similar to what's going on now, 2008, 2009. Nothing was corrected. It was just made worse. The middle class is continuing to hurt and be destroyed, and at the expense of the top 1/10% and so forth. So that's my concern, is that there could be this sort of anger welling up in the population without people really understanding what's going on, that could overflow into something really nasty. But on the other hand, as you say, we know 100% what we're getting with Hillary. There's a chance perhaps something good could come out of a change in power.
And of course, the current system is pretty nasty as it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. It's a very nasty, not only for people in America, but for the whole world. The U.S. is not a benefit to mankind, despite all the propaganda.
You know, there was an excellent interview that you did with Roger Stone. And one of the things you mentioned in your discussion was you were disappointed after Reagan was elected. This sort of outsider who wasn't supposed to be elected came in, was voted in by the people, and then immediately he was surrounded by the same group of people. George W. Bush, of course, Senior Bush, son of Prescott, was brought in, and the power elite circled the wagon again. What do you think the chances are of that happening if Trump were elected?
You know, I just want to mention that I think Reagan, if you examine his record, which is never done, by the way, as governor of California, he was a massive tax increaser. He was, in fact, all his tax increases helped bring on Prop 13. He was a big pro-abortion guy. He was a big socialized medicine guy. I mean, he was nothing like the propaganda. So Reagan, of course, was extremely charming and a wonderful speaker and personality and all that kind of thing. So that can certainly combine with very bad stuff. Franklin Roosevelt had a great personality, too. So who knows? I mean, certainly Trump has got a lot of establishment people around him. A lot of the people he's bringing on as advisors are no good. On the other hand, again, I look at Hillary and I look at Soros pulling her strings, and that's a pretty scary thing. But again, Obama's pretty scary. George W. Bush was scary. Clinton was scary. I mean, this is the U.S. regime is a very scary thing. We all feel it getting more totalitarian by the minute, seeking to regulate every aspect of our lives, every aspect of everything every businessman does, and making us all poorer unless you're in the government or at the very top of the regime. So it's very scary and awful what's happening right now, even though we're all supposed to be calm about it. We shouldn't be calm about it. We should be upset. We should be angry. We should want to do something about it. And it's very important, to quote Rothbard again, if we're talking about, say, economics questions, he said it's very important that people understand economic error and economic truth. It's very, very important they understand that. But that's insufficient to bring about change. You also have to show people they're being ripped off. So if people are feeling they're being ripped off, and they sure are being ripped off, that is a major step towards making some significant changes. Can we do it? I mean, it's a challenge.
Yeah, well, certainly, people do feel that they're being ripped off. I think that probably explains the phenomenon of Sanders and Trump. The question then is, can the wisdom of a Ron Paul, an understanding of what is really happening, what the real causes of them being ripped off is, for example, if people really understood the relationship of the Federal Reserve and the creation of money and the redistribution of wealth. But to get the average person to understand that, Lou, is very difficult, isn't it?
It is difficult, although, of course, as you mentioned, Ron has had tremendous effect in helping people understand what the Fed is. I would credit Ron with the Fed feeling under pressure, and they have felt under pressure ever since his presidential campaigns. They had started to hire PR people. They started to try to portray themselves as just great guys concerned with a common weal and so forth, rather than distant technocrats. I think Ron woke up a lot of people. We're so lucky to live in the age of Ron Paul, is all I can say, because if you look at all of American political history, all of American history, there's only ever been one Ron Paul. Every other politician, even Jefferson and people like that, had major failings in their times in office, major status steps. So Ron Paul, if we have a Ron Paul future, boy, are we going to be lucky.
Well, I think one of the things about Ron Paul, too, is he always remains an optimist. And I think that that's essential, too, Lou. It's very easy to get down on the world and the way things are going. But we do need to have some hope and some optimism. And Ron has planted that, I think, probably in a lot of young people. And who knows what the future might hold. I think all we can do, Lou, is do the best we can to tell the truth. I know that's what you do on your site, LewRockwell.com. And we'll just continue to carry on as long as the good Lord gives us breath and time on earth, right?
Hope is a virtue. So it's very important to have hope and to not give up. We may not give up. It's not right and it's not healthy. We have to keep fighting. And by the way, as you know, fighting for the right is a lot of fun as well as being a good thing. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.